Let's talk about aftermarket parts for your crawler. In particular, aftermarket axles. The axle is one of the components that can really determine how capable your crawler is in a lot of ways, but it is also, especially the front axle, what takes the majority of the beating while you're crawling. So I'd like to discuss axles. So on this VRD carbon that I built up, you can check out that series. Maybe it's floating somewhere around my head. I don't know how YouTube works anymore. In that series, I built this up and I determined that even straight out of the box, I wanted some aftermarket axles for it. And what I did was I replaced the front housing and the knuckles with an aluminum set from Vanquish. And in a previous video where I've spoken about aftermarket axles, I go over why I tend to choose certain companies for my aftermarket parts. You will always want to make sure that you're going to have good tolerance, that the parts are going to fit together between the stock and the aftermarket. And over the many, many years, I guess since I've been in crawling since 2003, we really didn't have a lot of aftermarket until like 2010 region, right? So in the last 14 years, I've seen a lot of aftermarket axles, a lot of them. And some of them are really low quality and some of them are really high quality. And the one thing that I have noticed is that the tolerances for the affordable ones are all over the place. Sometimes they don't even really fit right with stock parts. Sometimes your pinion mesh may be just wildly wrong, and you can fix that with shimming in most cases, but there's just a lot of problems. And then when you start mixing aftermarket parts from one company with another company, they generally just don't fit. I got some knuckle weights for my Capra actually, and they fit with the stock unit, but then with the aftermarket portals that I got that were also weighted, they didn't fit with those. And then that particular company didn't make the weighted brass outers, and so it was this pick and choose of what do I want to use, and that is very, very typical when you're talking about axle parts. So I always go with aftermarket parts, in particular from Vanquish and Super Shafty. When I'm talking about axles in particular, those are the two companies that I know work really hard to make sure that they get their tolerances not only good with the stock parts, but good within themselves. And I can always trust that the parts that I buy from them are going to fit the axles that I got from them, right? The worst thing is when you have all of these different parts that you bought for a build and you use 10 different vendors or whatever, and then suddenly you go to put it together and you realize, I can't put this together at all. And y'all have seen this in previous videos of mine where I've been assembling stuff and then realize, oh, you know, this part doesn't work with that part. These knuckles don't work with these wheels, etc., etc. It's really easy to find yourself in a position to where, oh, well, I was getting this ready for an event this weekend, and then suddenly, yeah, I can't because all these parts don't actually work together. So the way that I go for my axles, and when I'm going to do an aftermarket upgrade to any of my rigs, I mean, obviously the electronics, we know what selection of those are going to be. The first thing that I do, besides wheels and electronics, is going to be the axles. On all of these rigs, it's always axles. But it's almost always just the front axle. And the reason why I do that is for forward weight bias, because in a crawler, when you get up onto an obstacle, the more weight that you can have on those front tires, the more likely it is that you can literally lift yourself up onto the object with just your front traction. So forward weight bias. On this rig with the metal front axle plus the brass, we're sitting at maybe 60-40 or so. Actually, that may be a little further forwards than 60-40, but you can see where it's balancing on the skid. It's practically on the very front portion of this skid plate here. And I don't have a body reamer. A body reamer is actually, maybe I do. A body reamer is a really good, really good way to find your balance point, because it'll dig into your skid plate just enough to balance. Although I kind of ruined this one. I broke the tip off at some point in childhood, probably using it as a pry bar. I've had this body reamer for a really long time. All right, so I can't quite get it going side to side, but you can see here, front to back, we are about at the balance point. So it's pretty far forwards, and that just makes it so much easier to climb. And I could probably take a little bit more weight off the back somehow. I've got printed foams, which are kind of heavy for the rear, but they work really good for side hills. So probably not going to change that. And of course, not putting too much body weight in the back, not having a battery down there. If I used a smaller battery that was a little farther forwards, I could definitely do that. Something like a 1500 milliamp hour or whatever, I could slide that nice and forwards. I could also install a heavier motor. See, this is the 540M, it's very small. I could get more forward weight bias if I use a larger motor. Most people aren't gonna really wanna add that extra weight. 540M is kind of a perfect size in my opinion anyway, so I don't really want larger. But that's kind of my reasoning. When I do aftermarket axles, I want more weight. So I'm gonna do something like an aluminum in front with as much brass as I can get generally. And I want the parts to be compatible. I really don't want to find myself in a position to where, like in a previous video, it was Capra spec axles, but it had an offset pumpkin. Are the shafts compatible with, let's say, the offset pumpkin from Vanquish, or Super Shafty may have one? I don't know. And that's not something that I'm really willing to chase a rabbit hole down and find out when it's not a company that I'm used to. It's not a company that really appears to have aftermarket parts, and it's not something that I want to spend the time on long term, because it takes a lot of time to wrench on a rig, and I don't really have a lot of time to wrench on rigs. So I want to make sure that the time that I spend is good time, that I won't have to go and chase again later because of some oversight, if you get what I'm saying. I want to do it once and do it right, and that's it. So there we go on that one. This one, I built it up first thing with a set of aftermarket axles. This is the next rig that I'm going to change the axles out on, and these are the Capra width axles. I don't like them, it's too wide for 1.9s. It'd be great on 2.2s, but this is really, I really like this as a 1.9 rig. Maybe what I'll do is I'll throw 2.2s on this particular one, and then I'll build up my second one that you may or may not be able to see on camera. I'll build that one up with H10 axles. That's what these are, the H10 axles. You can see the width difference. And I've got wheels that are slammed in as far forwards as possible. The only downside of this is that this portion will rub, and on the rear in particular, I've been eating up the stubs. It's just not a good look, honestly. But as you can maybe see on the overhead cam, the width of these is a little different. I could get the H10 axles much more narrow, but I can't go any more narrow on these Capras. I'm already hitting the limits. And again, the stub axles are exposed, whereas the stub axles on these are probably a ½ inch on the inside. You really can't see them. They're not going to be dragging on the rocks. And we're looking at a difference of, maybe a quarter of an inch or 3/8. I guess I could say millimeters, somewhere between the 6 and 10 millimeter width difference, where the H10s already have the advantage, even though I'm not running really narrow wheels. We could go in further. Yeah, so when I replace these axles, or let's just pretend that I was going to upgrade this one instead of building a second rig, then what I would do is I would actually keep the plastic axle on the rear, nice and light, slides over the rocks really well, and then we are going to put an aluminum axle on the front. We're going to do brass outers. We're going to make this thing as heavy as possible. These are just stock Capra axles. I actually stole them from my Capra, and yeah, I suppose I could move. Ooh, it would be fun if I moved the plastic axle to the rear, kept it four-wheel steering, put an aluminum axle on the front, probably use an LP servo like our new SHV 650 LP, nice and light, really great for the rear, also be great for the front, but you could add more forward weight bias by having a larger one. Like this is our old 800 LP. I guess we didn't call it an LP, did we? Technically it was an LP, but full-size case. At any rate, now I'm just kind of getting off in the weeds, but smaller servo on the rear, you want that forward weight bias. I want the forward weight bias at least. So plastic axle definitely on the rear, and then aluminum axle on the front with all the brass. And again, a brand that I know long-term I can trust, get aftermarket parts from, and something that'll have tolerances that is actually fitting within the industry that we know from batch to batch. And if there's a problem, I can just call them and say, hey, this isn't fitting XYZ, and they'll either send me a new one or send some parts to fit or whatever they need to get done. And it's always a bummer when there is problems, for sure. And honestly, I've never really had fitment problems with Vanquish and Super Shafty, so I'm just saying, if there was a problem, that they would at least be there. They would at least be there for us. There's, like a phone number and an email and all that kind of stuff. With a lot of these eBay and Amazon vendors, they're a brand, but they don't have any other presence, right? So if you get something, you can always return it to Amazon, I suppose. There is that. Amazon's kind of a no questions asked return. So you could use Amazon to your advantage on that. But if you're paying for a set of $80 axles, you're getting a set of $80 axles. I would rather just continue to run plastics than run something that is of, you know, like sort of quality. And then if I want quality, then I step up for the high dollar stuff, because I just don't like breaking parts, and I want to make sure that they're going to fit long term and not waste my time. So yeah, there you go. Upgrading axles. This is kind of I really like doing it, and I haven't done it on enough rigs. Oh, while we're talking about it, TRX4M or TRX4, sorry. I really like the TRX4 axles for the sake of them being bomb-proof. They're built really stout, and Traxxas is good about that. They know that the majority of their users are bashers, right? So you really don't need to upgrade them in a lot of sense, but there are lots of aftermarket, essentially no-name brand, because at least as far as I'm aware, y'all can certainly correct me in the comments, there's not a lot of the higher end name brand stuff that is producing TRX4 aftermarket parts. Even though the market is there, it's very large, but for some reason, maybe because it's not really, I don't know, like, look at the difference between this axle, nice and sexy, and it's got tons of clearance, and I know I've got one around here. Here we go, and multiples here. This will be easier to see. And then this axle, let's just pull the body off so you can see a little better. The TRX4 axle, although bomb-proof for all intents and purposes, it doesn't have good clearance at all. It's not scale really at all, and it's not bad. It could be worse, certainly. All right, what's okay? Nothing making noise. It could be worse, but you can see how much it hangs down. The pumpkin hangs down right there. It's not bad, but it's not really a performance axle. It doesn't really look scale. And if I am going to replace the axles on my TRX4s, unless they have the locking and unlocking diffs, unless it's that, I'm not going to reuse Traxxas axles. Honestly, I'm going to throw something else in there. And this is one reason why I really haven't upgraded a lot of my TRX4s. And I know I probably keep saying TRX4M by accident. It's been on my brain lately. But I mean TRX4s. So I haven't actually upgraded any of the axles on them, but I've never broken anything on the axles. We've smoked plenty of stock servos, but the axles themselves seem to be pretty solid. So at least they got that going for them. But if I was going to replace the axles, I would not keep the same ones. I'd end up building a mutt rig. I would use something that was, I mean, honestly, I love these H10s from Vanquish. I would probably just use H10s. H10 the world. There we go. I gotta put that back where it belongs. So if you have any questions or you have any comments, some suggestions for other people, let us know down below in the comments and let me know what you think. What are your guidelines when you go to replace parts? Are axles your first thing, or do you go for something else? You know, other than tires and wheels and electronics, axles are always what I go for. I guess shocks could be a good one too, so maybe there's some good brands of shocks y'all could recommend. There we go. That's a discussion that I wasn't planning on having, but it was on the brain, so we are talking about that. As always, thanks for tuning in. Have a great day. You've made it to the end of the video. Hopefully that means you liked what you saw. If you want to help out the channel, you can like, subscribe, and definitely comment down below. We would like to hear new ideas from you, so be sure you let us know what you'd like to see. There are some other suggestions probably floating by my head right now that you can check out, and otherwise we appreciate your support and your help growing the channel.